3 mud-covered dogs shook vigorously, sending spatters of thick brown muck flying through the air. The elegant white wedding tent behind me erupted in gasps and screams as designer dresses and tailored suits became dotted with country mud. I stood there, soaked to the bone, veterinary supplies still clutched in my hands, watching the chaos unfold in slow motion. Karen stormed toward me, her face contorted with rage, designer heels sinking into the wet ground with each furious step. "You did this on purpose," she screamed, pointing an accusatory finger at me and my faithful companions. "You have ruined my daughter's wedding. I will sue you for everything you own." Behind her, guests in varying states of mud-spattered formal wear stared in shock. Some looked outraged, others confused. A few even seemed to be hiding smiles. But I was beyond caring about their reactions. After months of bullying, illegal HOA formation, and now being completely blocked into my own property during a livestock emergency, something inside me had snapped. I looked Corinne directly in the eyes as my 3 loyal ranch dogs moved protectively to my side. That was the moment I realized this was not just about muddy wedding guests. This was war, and I had all the ammunition I needed. The morning sun cast long shadows across my modest ranch as I made my way to the barn. This property had been my sanctuary for nearly 7 years, ever since I left behind the suffocating confines of city life and corporate politics. I purchased these 15 acres with every penny I had saved, determined to build a life of quiet independence. The sound of my boots crunching on the gravel driveway was accompanied by the enthusiastic patting of paws. Rusty, Boomer, and Scout, my 3 ranch dogs, bounded ahead of me, already anticipating the morning routine. They were not fancy purebreds or pampered pets. They were working dogs, intelligent and loyal, essential to maintaining the property and handling the small herd of livestock I kept. Rusty, the oldest at 8 years, was a red heeler mix with one ear that flopped over while the other stood at attention. Boomer was a sturdy black and white border collie with boundless energy. Scout, the youngest at 3 years old, was a shepherd mix who had shown up as a half-starved stray and decided to stay. Together, they were not just companions but indispensable partners in my rural existence. For years, the neighboring property had belonged to an elderly couple who kept to themselves, but were always friendly when our paths crossed. We maintained an unspoken respect for each other's boundaries. They never complained about my early morning routines or occasional tractor noise, and I always made sure my animals respected the property line that separated our land. 6 months ago, the elderly couple sold their 20-acre property and moved to Arizona to be closer to their grandchildren. The property remained vacant for several weeks before the moving trucks arrived. From my kitchen window, I watched as expensive furniture and elaborate garden ornaments were unloaded. The new neighbors had arrived. I did not want to seem unwelcoming, so I baked a loaf of homemade bread and walked over to introduce myself. That was my first encounter with Patricia Harrington, though I did not know then that she would soon be known throughout our small rural community simply as Corinne. Patricia answered the door in what appeared to be designer loungewear, her highlighted blonde hair perfectly styled despite the moving chaos behind her. Her smile seemed practiced as she accepted my bread with 2 fingertips, as if worried it might contaminate her manicure. "How quaint," she said, glancing at the simple loaf. "We are still getting settled, but perhaps you could come for proper tea once we are organized. I am Patricia, and my husband Robert is around somewhere, probably hiding from all this chaos." Something in her tone made me feel like I was being assessed and found lacking, but I pushed the feeling aside. Moving is stressful for anyone, especially transitioning from what was clearly urban living to our rural community. Over the following weeks, our interactions remained cordial but increasingly strained. Patricia asked pointed questions about local zoning, seemed horrified when I mentioned the septic system instead of city sewage, and visibly recoiled when my dogs barked in the distance. One afternoon, while repairing a section of fence along our shared boundary, I overheard Patricia on her phone, packing on her expansive new deck. "The neighborhood has potential, but some elements are simply not up to standard," she was saying. "Especially the property next door. Barking dogs all hours, farm equipment visible from the road. No sense of aesthetics whatsoever." I pretended not to hear, focusing on hammering the fence post with perhaps more force than necessary. But something cold settled in my stomach. I had dealt with difficult people throughout my life. It was partly why I had chosen this isolated lifestyle. But something told me Patricia Harrington was going to be a special kind of problem. My dog sensed my unease, gathering around me as I finished the fence repair. Little did I know then that those 3 loyal animals would soon become the center of a neighborhood battle that would test the limits of my patience, my resources, and ultimately deliver the most satisfying lesson in karma I had ever witnessed. The official-looking envelope arrived on a Tuesday morning. No personal address, just "current resident" printed in bold letters. Inside was a letter on heavy cream stationery with an embossed header reading Countryside Estates Homeowners Association. I read it once, then again, certain there must be some mistake. According to this document, a homeowners association had been formed for our rural community, complete with bylaws, a governing board, and monthly dues of $120. But most alarming were the community standards, outlined in painstaking detail across 3 densely typed pages. Properties were required to maintain aesthetic uniformity. Fences could not exceed 4 feet in height. Farm equipment must be stored in enclosed structures, not visible from any road or neighboring property. And most concerning to me, pets must be contained within approved fencing or kennels at all times. Excessive barking will result in warnings followed by fines of $50 per incident. I had lived here for 7 years. Never once had there been mention of a homeowners association, nor had I signed any covenant when purchasing my property. This rural area had always operated on simple principles of mutual respect and independence, values that had drawn many of us here in the first place. I was still holding the letter when a small procession of vehicles turned into my driveway. Patricia stepped out of a gleaming white SUV, followed by 4 other neighbors I recognized, but did not know well. They had all moved to the area within the last 3 years, purchasing the larger properties that had been subdivided from original farmland. Patricia wore crisp white pants, an expensive-looking blue blouse, and designer boots that had clearly never seen actual farm work. She carried a leather portfolio and wore the tight smile of someone about to conduct unwelcome business. The others followed behind her like an entourage, clutching clipboards and avoiding direct eye contact with me. "Good morning," Patricia called out with artificial cheerfulness. "I see you have received our introduction packet. We are making personal visits to ensure everyone understands the new community standards." I do not understand how a homeowners association could be formed without all homeowners being notified or having a vote, I replied, my voice calmer than I felt. Patricia's smile tightened further. The formation was completely legal. We had the required percentage of property owners sign the covenant. These standards will increase all our property values and create a more desirable community. She gestured toward my front yard, where my tractor sat under a weathered tarp. "For instance, that equipment should be properly stored out of sight, and your fence exceeds the height restriction by at least 2 feet." As if on cue, Rusty and Scout began barking from the side yard, alerted by the unfamiliar voices. Patricia's expression hardened. "And those dogs," she said, her voice dropping to a disapproving tone. "There have been numerous complaints about the noise. According to our bylaws, persistent barking constitutes a nuisance and will incur fines after an initial warning period." "Complaints from whom?" I asked, looking pointedly at the four neighbors who still seemed unable to meet my gaze. "I have never received a single complaint about my dogs in 7 years. One of the men in Patricia's group, a retired banker named Thomas who had moved in about 2 years ago, cleared his throat uncomfortably. "The formal association is new, but the concerns have been building for some time." Patricia cut him off with a sharp glance. "The point is, the HOA is now established, and all properties within the designated boundaries must comply with the standards. You have 30 days to address the items listed in your compliance review." She thrust a separate sheet of paper toward me. I did not take it. I never agreed to join any association. My deed has no covenants or restrictions. "That is not relevant," Patricia replied, her composure slipping slightly. "The HOA formation had sufficient support from the community. Compliance is not optional." She placed the compliance review on my porch railing and turned to leave, her entourage following behind. As they walked away, I heard her mutter, "Some people simply do not understand community standards." That evening, I drove to the county record's office. The clerk, a woman named Dorothy who had worked there for decades, helped me search through property records and HOA filings. What we discovered confirmed my suspicions. The HOA documentation had been filed, but with questionable signatures and boundaries that appeared to have been added after initial signings. "This does not look right to me," Dorothy whispered, glancing over her shoulder though the office was empty. "I have seen a lot of HOA formations over the years, and this one has some irregularities." I took copies of everything, thanked Dorothy, and headed home. As I pulled into my driveway, my headlights swept across my property, the modest house I had lovingly maintained, the barn I had built with my own hands, the fields where my dogs ran freely. Patricia Harrington might have money and influence, but this was my home, and I was not about to let an illegitimate HOA dictate how I lived on my own land. Spring arrived with an explosion of wildflowers and birdsong across my property, but the peaceful transition of seasons was disrupted by the rumble of construction equipment next door. Each morning, I woke to the sound of trucks and workers transforming the Harrington property. Curious, I walked the perimeter of my land one evening, staying well within my property line. What I saw made my jaw drop. A massive white tent pavilion was being erected near our shared boundary. Workers were installing elaborate decorative lighting in the trees. A wooden platform that could only be a dance floor was taking shape. This was not simple landscaping. The Harringtons were building what appeared to be an event venue. 2 days later, a glossy invitation arrived in my mailbox. "Mr. and Mrs. Robert Harrington request your presence at the wedding of their daughter, Elizabeth Ann Harrington, to William Joseph Caldwell." The date was set for 3 weeks away. While the gesture of including me might have seemed neighborly, the note scrawled at the bottom revealed the true purpose. "We trust there will be no disturbances from your animals during this special weekend." Not a genuine invitation, a warning. The following week, Patricia appeared at my door, her smile strained and her eyes cold. "I wanted to discuss some arrangements for Elizabeth's wedding," she began without greeting. "We have guests coming from across the country, many of them quite influential. It is imperative that everything be perfect." "Congratulations on your daughter's wedding," I replied neutrally. "How can I help?" "We need your cooperation on several items," Patricia said, consulting a list on her phone. "First, your dogs must be kept completely silent during the entire weekend, Friday through Sunday. Perhaps you could board them elsewhere. Second, that unsightly tractor needs to be removed from view. Third, your barn needs repainting before the event. The weathered look is quite rustic." I blinked, momentarily speechless at her audacity. "Patricia, I can try to keep the dogs quiet during the ceremony itself, but I cannot guarantee silence for an entire weekend. They are working dogs on a working ranch. As for my tractor and barn, they have been here for years, and they are well within my property line." Patricia's expression hardened. This is precisely the uncooperative attitude the HOA was formed to address. Elizabeth's wedding is the social event of the season. Surely you can make accommodations for 3 days. "I will do my best with the dogs during the actual ceremony," I repeated firmly. "But I am not repainting my barn or relocating equipment that is rightfully on my property." Patricia left in a huff, muttering about unreasonable neighbors and property values. I immediately wrote down everything from our conversation, adding it to the growing file of documented interactions. Something told me this would not be the end of her demands. 3 days later, a certified letter arrived from Countryside Estates HOA legal counsel. It claimed my dogs constituted a nuisance under county ordinance, and demanded they be properly contained and silenced during the upcoming wedding weekend, or I would face fines of $500 per incident of disturbance. I called the county animal control officer, a reasonable man named Jim who had helped me rescue Scout 3 years earlier. "Jim, have there been any official complaints filed about my dogs?" "Not a single one," he confirmed. "Your animals are well behaved and stay on your property. Someone fishing for complaints." "Something like that," I replied, explaining the situation with the Harringtons and their wedding. Jim sighed. "Not the first time I have heard about this new HOA causing problems. Just document everything, and know that as far as the county is concerned, your dogs are in full compliance with all ordinances." I thanked him and hung up, adding his statement to my documentation file. As the wedding weekend approached, construction next door intensified. I watched with growing concern as temporary parking areas were marked out along the shared boundary of our properties. Something told me that Patricia Harrington was not done making demands or causing problems. #Bricks Part 4, The Blocked Driveway. Target word count, 850. The day of Elizabeth Harrington's wedding dawned clear and mild, perfect weather for an outdoor ceremony. I had risen early to complete my chores, hopping to minimize any activity that might carry over to the neighboring property during the actual ceremony. Despite my issues with Patricia, I had no desire to disrupt her daughter's special day. By mid-morning, vehicles began arriving. What started as a trickle soon became a steady stream of luxury cars and SUVs with out-of-state plates. Men in black suits directed traffic, guiding guests toward what appeared to be designated parking areas. To my alarm, these impromptu parking attendants began directing vehicles to line up along the country road, including the area directly in front of my driveway entrance. I watched from my porch as the first car partially blocked my access, then a second pulled in behind it, and soon my entire driveway entrance was obstructed by a wall of expensive vehicles. I pulled on my boots and walked down to speak with one of the parking attendants, a young man who looked uncomfortable in his formal attire under the warming sun. "Excuse me," I said politely. "These cars are blocking my driveway. I need to maintain access to the road." The young man glanced nervously toward the Harrington property. "Sorry, but Mrs. Harrington specifically instructed us to maximize parking along this stretch. She said it would not be a problem. It is very much a problem, I replied, keeping my voice level. This is my only access point. These vehicles need to be moved. He shifted uncomfortably. I will have to check with Mrs. Harrington. In the meantime, is there somewhere else you could park if you need to go out? Perhaps along the road further down. I stared at him in disbelief. This is my property. I should not have to park elsewhere to accommodate wedding guests who are illegally blocking my access. The attendant mumbled another apology but made no move to address the situation. I returned to my house and wrote a polite note explaining the access issue, then placed it on the windshields of the vehicles blocking my driveway. Perhaps the owners would be more reasonable than Patricia. An hour later, I looked outside to find Patricia herself marching up my driveway, my notes clutched in her hand. She wore an elaborate pale blue dress and had clearly been interrupted during pre-wedding preparations. "What is the meaning of this?" she demanded, waving the notes. "You are upsetting our guests on the most important day of my daughter's life." "Your guests are illegally blocking my driveway," I responded calmly. "That creates a safety hazard and prevents me from accessing my own property." Patricia dismissed my concern with a wave of her manicured hand. "It is just for one day. Surely you can manage without driving anywhere for a few hours. Most of these people have traveled from out of state for this event." "That does not give them the right to block my access," I insisted. "What if there is an emergency?" "Do not be dramatic," Patricia snapped. "The ceremony starts in less than an hour. I do not have time for this pettiness. Your interference is exactly why we needed an HOA in this community." She turned on her heel and stormed back to her property, my notes now crumpled in her fist. I watched her go, a sense of foreboding settling over me. If she would not address the situation, I would need to call the county sheriff's office to report the illegal parking. Before I could make the call, my cell phone rang. It was Miguel, my part-time ranch hand who helped with the livestock on the back portion of my property. "Boss, we have a problem," Miguel said, his voice tense. "The pregnant heifer is down and not looking good. The vet needs to come immediately or we might lose her and the calf." My stomach dropped. "I will call Dr. Ramirez right away." Dr. Ramirez answered on the second ring and agreed to come immediately given the emergency. I gathered the necessary supplies and headed toward my truck, only to remember with a sinking feeling that I was completely blocked in. I ran back to the boundary of the Harrington property, where guests in formal attire were now being escorted to elegantly decorated seating under the massive white tent. I spotted one of the parking attendants and hurried over to him. "I have a medical emergency with my livestock," I explained urgently. "I need these vehicles moved immediately so I can get veterinary supplies to the back pasture." The young man looked genuinely concerned but also panicked. "The ceremony is about to begin. Mrs. Harrington gave strict instructions that nothing is to disrupt the proceedings. Maybe after the ceremony." "This cannot wait until after the ceremony," I interrupted. "An animal could die. Please find the owners of these vehicles now." "I cannot interrupt the ceremony to make announcements about cars," he replied, backing away. "Mrs. Harrington would." "Then I will do it myself," I said, starting toward the gathering. The attendant grabbed my arm. "Please do not. Security has been instructed to remove anyone who disrupts the event." I pulled my arm free, stunned by the implication that I would be forcibly removed for requesting access to my own property. Looking at the sea of unfamiliar faces and the private security personnel stationed around the perimeter, I realized this confrontation would not solve my immediate problem. My phone buzzed with a text from Miguel. Situation getting worse. Where is the vet? I had to make a decision. The main driveway was completely blocked, but there was another way to reach the back pasture, a rarely used access path through the lower portion of my property. It was muddy and difficult to navigate, especially after the recent spring rains, but in an emergency, it was my only option. I hurried back to my house, calling Dr. Ramirez to direct him to meet Miguel directly at the back access point. Then I whistled for my dogs. Whatever was about to happen, I knew I would need their help navigating the challenging terrain of the back property. As Rusty, Boomer, and Scout bounded to my side, I gathered emergency veterinary supplies in a backpack and headed toward the rear of my property, the sounds of wedding music floating ironically through the air behind me. # Bricks Part 5, The Muddy Rescue Mission. Target word count, 950. Dark clouds gathered on the horizon as I led my 3 dogs toward the rarely used back access path. This route cut through the lowest part of my property, a section I typically avoided because seasonal rains turned it into a muddy mess. Today, with my main driveway blockaded by waiting cars, I had no choice. I adjusted the backpack containing emergency veterinary supplies and glanced at my phone. Dr. Ramirez had texted that he was en route to meet Miguel at the back access point, but even with his specialized veterinary truck, the muddy conditions would slow him down considerably. "Come on, boys," I called to my dogs. They trotted ahead, seeming to understand the urgency of our mission. Scout took the lead, his shepherd instincts kicking in as he sought the firmest path forward. Rusty and Boomer flanked him, occasionally testing different routes before returning to the main path. The first section was manageable, a narrow trail winding through stands of pine trees that had kept the ground relatively dry. But as we descended toward the lower acres, the path gradually deteriorated. My boots sank ankle-deep in mud, making each step a laborious effort. Halfway down the slope, the skis opened up. Rain poured down in heavy sheets, instantly transforming the merely muddy path into a treacherous slog. I pulled the rain cover over my backpack to protect the medical supplies and pressed forward, grateful for the sturdy work boots that kept my feet relatively dry despite the conditions. My dogs, of course, had no such protection. They were soon covered in mud from paws to bellies as they navigated the increasingly difficult terrain. Scout, ever the pathfinder, would test an area before turning back to guide me toward firmer ground. Rusty, the oldest and most experienced, kept close to my side, occasionally pressing against my leg when my footing seemed unstable. Boomer ranged ahead and behind, his border collie instincts keeping our small group together. "Good boys," I encouraged them, my voice nearly lost in the downpour. "We are almost there." The rain intensified, drumming against my hat and shoulders. Visibility diminished to just a few yards ahead. A flash of lightning illuminated the landscape, followed by a rumble of thunder that caused even steady Rusty to glance up nervously. At the bottom of the property, where my land met an access easement, we faced the worst obstacle yet, a section where runoff had created a wide mud slough. In dry conditions, this would have been merely a shallow depression. Today, it was a mud pit nearly 2 feet deep in places. My dogs did not hesitate. Scout plunged in first, his legs disappearing up to his chest in the mud. He pushed forward determinedly, finding a slightly shallower path and turning to bark encouragement. I followed his lead, wincing as cold mud seeped over the tops of my boots and soaked my pants to the knees. Halfway across, my right foot became stuck, the suction of the mud nearly pulling my boot off when I tried to take another step. Boomer circled back, whining with concern. I reached down to brace myself against the mud, my hands and arms now as filthy as my faithful companions. "I am okay, boy," I assured him, finally wrenching my foot free with a loud sucking sound. "Keep going." After what seemed like hours but was likely only 20 minutes of struggle, we reached the relative firmness of the access easement road. Dr. Ramirez's truck was visible in the distance, its hazard lights flashing through the rain. Miguel stood under a tarp rigged as a temporary shelter, relief washing over his face as he spotted us. "Thank goodness you made it," he called over the rain. "Dr. Ramirez is with her now." I hurried to the makeshift treatment area where the veterinarian was attending to the struggling heifer. The situation was indeed critical, a breech birth that required immediate intervention. I handed over the additional supplies I had carried, and for the next hour, we worked together in the rain to save both mother and calf. When the newborn calf finally appeared, small and slick but definitely alive, the sense of relief was palpable. Dr. Ramirez grinned up at me from his position in the mud. "She will be fine," he assured me, patting the exhausted mother cow. "Both of them will. Good thing you got here when you did." "It was not easy," I replied, gesturing toward the mud-covered path we had traversed. "My regular access is completely blocked by wedding guests next door." Dr. Ramirez frowned. "That is illegal. They cannot block your driveway." "Tell that to Patricia Harrington," I said wearily. "Today is her daughter's wedding, and apparently that trumps all local ordinances and common courtesy." "Well, the rain has stopped at least," Miguel observed, looking up at the sky where patches of blue were beginning to appear between the clouds. "But getting back to the house." I looked down at myself, then at my 3 dogs. We were all covered in thick, clinging mud from our journey. Rusty's red coat was now a uniform brown. Scout's face was the only part of him still recognizable. Boomer's black and white pattern had been transformed into mottled shades of mud. I could only imagine how I looked. "I need to get back," I said, checking the time. According to the invitation I had received, the ceremony would be over, but the reception would be in full swing. "Miguel, can you finish up here? Dr. Ramirez, thank you for coming out in these conditions." "Just doing my job," the veterinarian replied with a shrug. "But I would document this incident if I were you. Blocking emergency access is serious." I nodded, already pulling out my phone to take photos of the muddy conditions we had been forced to navigate due to the blocked driveway. I took pictures of my mud-covered self and the equally filthy dogs as evidence of what we had endured. The trek back would be just as challenging, but at least the rain had stopped. I called to my dogs, who shook themselves vigorously but managed only to rearrange the mud rather than remove it. Together, we turned back toward the house, facing the difficult return journey through the property's muddy lowlands. As we climbed the slippery path, I could hear music and laughter floating from the Harrington property. The contrast between their elegant celebration and our mud-soaked rescue mission struck me as a perfect metaphor for the clash of worlds that had been brewing since Patricia and Robert moved in. What would they think, I wondered, if their pristine wedding reception were suddenly confronted with the reality of country living, mud, livestock emergencies, and all? I did not have to wait long for my answer. #Bricks Part 6, The Muddy Aftermath. Target word count, 700. As we crested the final slope toward my house, the full spectacle of the Harrington wedding reception came into view. The afternoon sun had emerged after the rain, casting a golden glow over the white tents and well-dressed guests. Crystal glasses caught the light, creating prisms across tables adorned with elaborate floral arrangements. A string quartet played something classical while guests in formal attire mingled on what had been until recently, a simple country property. The most direct path to my house unfortunately required passing near the reception area, right by the line of parked cars that still blocked my driveway. I was exhausted, filthy, and frustrated, but I had no choice. I would walk my dogs past the edge of the wedding reception to reach my own home. "Come on, boys," I called to my mud-caked companions. "Stay close." We followed the fence line that separated our properties. The dogs, sensing home was near, picked up their pace. As we approached the area where the cars were parked, a group of guests had gathered outside the tent, champagne glasses in hand, taking a break from the festivities. What happened next occurred with the perfect timing that only unscripted reality can provide. My 3 large, completely mud-covered dogs, having just trudged through a mile of muck and rain, did what dogs naturally do when they finally reach relatively dry ground. They shook. Vigorously. One after another, starting with Scout, then Boomer, and finally Rusty, they performed the full-body shake that dogs have perfected over thousands of years of evolution. Each shake sent an impressive spray of mud particles flying in all directions, including toward the immaculately dressed wedding guests and their equally pristine vehicles. "Oh my God!" a woman in a pale pink dress shrieked, jumping back as spots of mud freckled her ensemble. "What is that?" "My car!" a man in a gray suit exclaimed, staring in horror as the side of his luxury sedan received a generous spatter of country mud. I froze, watching as my dogs, oblivious to the chaos they had created, continued their natural behavior. They were not on the Harrington property. They were not approaching or threatening anyone. They were simply being dogs, shaking off mud after a difficult journey. Before I could decide how to respond, Patricia Harrington emerged from the tent, likely drawn by the commotion. She took in the scene, her muddy guests, the spattered cars, my filthy dogs, and equally mud-covered self, and her face transformed into a mask of pure rage. "You," she screamed, pointing an accusatory finger at me. "You did this deliberately. You have ruined Elizabeth's wedding reception." She stormed toward me, her designer heels sinking into the still soft ground with each furious step. Her husband Robert appeared behind her, looking alarmed and reaching for her arm, but she shook him off. "This is sabotage," Patricia continued, her voice rising to a pitch that caused several guests to wince. "First you refuse to comply with HOA regulations, then you disrupt our event with your filthy animals." I stood my ground, acutely aware of the audience that had gathered to watch the confrontation. Quietly, I reached into my pocket and activated my phone's recording function, a habit I had developed since the HOA documents first arrived. "Patricia," I said calmly, "your guests illegally blocked my driveway. I had a livestock emergency that required immediate attention. Because I could not use my driveway, my dogs, and I had to cross through the muddy back section of my property." "Do not lie to me," Patricia hissed. "You could have waited until after the reception. You did this to get back at me for the HOA notices." "I have a newborn calf and mother who would disagree," I replied evenly. "Dr. Ramirez can confirm the emergency. I have a right to access my property at all times, and my dogs have a right to be on my land." By now, Robert had reached his wife's side. "Patricia, perhaps we should continue this discussion later," he suggested quietly, eyeing the growing crowd of onlookers. "No," Patricia snapped. "I want everyone to see what kind of neighbor we have been dealing with. Do you know this person refused to make simple accommodations for our daughter's wedding? And now look, mud everywhere, designer dresses ruined. This was a deliberate act of vandalism." One of the guests, A tall man with silver hair stepped forward. "Are you saying these cars are blocking this person's driveway?" Patricia waved dismissively. "That is beside the point. The issue is the disruption to our event." The silver-haired man frowned. "Actually, as an attorney, I can tell you that blocking someone's access to their property is illegal. If there was a legitimate emergency—" "There was," I interjected. "I have documentation and witnesses." Patricia's face flushed deeper. "You will be hearing from our lawyers. I am going to sue you for every penny you have. Emotional distress, property damage, deliberate sabotage." "Your HOA is illegitimate," I interrupted quietly. "I have the county records to prove it. The formation documents contain irregularities that make them legally questionable at best, fraudulent at worst." Patricia's tirade stopped abruptly. For a moment she stared at me in shock. Then her eyes narrowed. "You are bluffing." "I am not," I replied. "But this is neither the time nor place for that discussion. Right now, I would appreciate it if your guests would move their vehicles so I can access my driveway." The silver-haired attorney turned to the gathered guests. "If anyone here is parked in front of this person's driveway, I strongly suggest you move your vehicle immediately." Several guests shuffled uncomfortably before hurrying toward the parked cars. Patricia stood frozen, her carefully constructed facade of control visibly crumbling. Robert finally succeeded in taking her arm and steering her back toward the reception tent, murmuring something about handling this privately. As they retreated, I heard Patricia's voice rise once more. "This is not over, not by a long shot." I looked down at my 3 mud-covered defenders, who gazed back with unwavering loyalty despite their bedraggled appearance. "No," I agreed quietly, though Patricia was too far away to hear. "I do not believe it is." #Bricks Part 7, Justice Served. Target word count, 750. The lawsuit arrived 3 days after the wedding, delivered by a process server who looked deeply uncomfortable as he handed me the thick envelope. Patricia and Robert Harrington were suing me for damages to personal property, emotional distress, and malicious interference with a private event. They were demanding $50,000 in compensation. I took the papers directly to James Whittaker, a local attorney who specialized in property disputes and had lived in our community for decades. His office was modest, a converted farmhouse with creaking floors and walls lined with legal texts, but his reputation was sterling. James adjusted his reading glasses as he examined the lawsuit, occasionally making notes on a yellow legal pad. When he finished, he looked up with an expression that hovered between amusement and disbelief. "This is quite something," he said, tapping the documents. "They are claiming you intentionally directed your dogs to shake mud on wedding guests as an act of malice." "That is ridiculous," I replied. "I was returning from a veterinary emergency after being forced to use the muddy back access because wedding guests blocked my driveway." "I believe you," James assured me, "and better yet, we can prove it." Over the next 2 weeks, we built our defense. Dr. Ramirez provided a signed statement confirming the emergency call and the blocked access. Miguel contributed photographs and his own testimony. Dorothy from the county records office agreed to testify about the irregularities in the HOA formation documents. I compiled all my own evidence: photographs of the blocked driveway, recordings of conversations with Patricia, the contradictory and potentially fraudulent HOA paperwork. Most surprisingly, 3 of my neighbors, including Thomas, the retired banker who had been part of Patricia's original HOA delegation, came forward with their own statements. They admitted they had been pressured into signing the HOA documents under false pretenses, told that Everyone else had already agreed, when in fact they were among the first approached. "We should not just defend," James advised during one of our strategy sessions. "We should countersue. They blocked emergency access to your property, which is illegal, and the HOA formation appears to involve actual fraud." I agreed, and James filed a countersuit requesting damages for illegal blocking of property access and an injunction to dissolve the HOA entirely. The judge assigned to our case was Elena Martinez, a no-nonsense woman who had grown up on a ranch herself before pursuing law. During the initial hearing, she showed little patience for the Harringtons' expensive city attorney and his dramatic portrayal of vicious dogs deliberately shaking mud onto innocent wedding guests. "Let me be clear," Judge Martinez interrupted during the attorney's opening statement. "Are you claiming the defendant trained their dogs to shake mud on command as an act of revenge?" The attorney faltered. "We are claiming a pattern of hostile behavior culminating in a deliberate act to disrupt my client's daughter's wedding celebration." "And did this disruption occur on the defendant's property or the plaintiff's property?" the judge asked. "Well, technically on the boundary between properties," the attorney admitted. Judge Martinez raised an eyebrow. "So the defendant and their dogs were on their own property, and these dogs, after traveling through mud, shook themselves. Is that your claim of malicious intent?" When presented with evidence of the blocked driveway, Judge Martinez's expression darkened. "Blocking emergency access to a property is not just inconsiderate, it is dangerous and illegal." The trial lasted 3 days. One by one, witnesses testified to the Harringtons' pattern of overreach, manipulation, and disregard for property rights. The county animal control officer confirmed that my dogs had never been the subject of legitimate complaints. The original HOA documents were examined in detail, with Dorothy pointing out specific irregularities that suggested signatures had been added to pages after the fact. When the silver-haired attorney who had been a guest at the wedding took the stand, he proved to be a particularly damaging witness for the Harringtons. As a specialist in property law from a prestigious firm in the city, his testimony about witnessing Patricia's admission that she knew the driveway was blocked carried significant weight. "In my professional opinion," he stated, "the plaintiffs demonstrated willful disregard for their neighbors' property rights and emergency access needs." On the final day, Patricia took the stand. Under James's careful cross-examination, her carefully constructed facade crumbled. She admitted she had directed parking attendants to use the area in front of my driveway despite knowing it would block access. She conceded that the HOA documents had been expedited through unconventional means. When pressed about her motivation, she finally snapped. "People like that have no business living next to civilized homeowners," she declared, gesturing dismissively toward me. "Decrepit barns, noisy animals, mud everywhere. They bring down property values and destroy community standards." The courtroom fell silent. Judge Martinez studied Patricia for a long moment before speaking. "Mrs. Harrington," she said quietly, "I grew up on a working ranch not unlike the defendant's property. The community you speak of existed long before you arrived. From the evidence presented, it appears you attempted to impose your own standards without regard for existing property rights or community values." 2 days later, Judge Martinez delivered her ruling. She not only dismissed the Harringtons' lawsuit but granted our countersuit in full. The illegitimate HOA was formally dissolved. The Harringtons were ordered to pay damages for illegally blocking emergency access, plus all legal fees. Most satisfyingly, they were required to issue a formal written apology to be published in the local newspaper. As James and I left the courthouse, he smiled and shook my hand. "Justice served," he said simply. The aftermath was unexpectedly positive. The Harringtons put their property up for sale less than a month later, reportedly returning to the city where they felt community standards were properly valued. Several neighbors reached out to repair relationships that had been strained by the HOA conflict. Thomas, the retired banker, even stopped by with homemade cookies and an apology for his role in the HOA scheme. "I should have known better," he admitted. "The country is about respecting each other's space and helping in emergencies, not about controlling every aspect of your neighbor's property." 6 months later, a young couple with 2 small children bought the Harrington property. When they came over to introduce themselves, they brought a plant as a housewarming gift and asked thoughtful questions about rural living. "We moved out here because we wanted space and freedom," the husband explained, "and to learn about country life." Their children immediately fell in love with my dogs, who had become minor celebrities in the community after the trial. Rusty, Boomer, and Scout soaked up the attention, showing no signs of the mud-covered defenders they had been on that fateful wedding day. That evening, I sat on my porch with my faithful companions at my feet, watching the sunset paint the sky in brilliant colors over my modest ranch. The barn remained the same weathered color it had always been. The tractor still sat under its tarp by the fence, and my dogs still had the freedom to roam their territory, doing the jobs they were born to do. In the end, the most satisfying revenge was not the legal victory or financial compensation. It was the simple right to continue living authentically on my own terms, on my own land, with my own beloved animals, muddy paws and all.